1924, Chicago. In the suburb of Cicero, Joseph Klenner, the town's mayor, addresses a crowd of reporters. Behind him stands the man who secured his election, mobster Alphonse Capone.
Al Capone realized that part of the secret to power was to control local governments, which he did by bribing officials. He controlled a local mayor, Joseph Klenner, whom he considered his guy, who was duty-bound to obey his orders.
But Capone isn't happy. The mayor has gone off message and unexpectedly speaks out against illegal speakeasies, which are the foundation of Capone's criminal empire. Capone isn't going to allow such public disrespect.
So he and the mayor were standing on the steps of City Hall, and they had some kind of argument, so Al just whipped out the blackjack.
He literally kicked the mayor down the steps to show publicly this is what happens to people, even politicians, who defy Al Capone.
Other mob bosses would put the mayor straight behind closed doors. But not Al Capone. In this part of Chicago, he fears no one. What kind of man can beat up the mayor directly in front of the cops and get away with it? Capone's rise to power in Chicago begins in the years of Prohibition. In 1919, the US government outlaws the sale of booze. Selling beer or whiskey is now a crime. Cue the arrival of a young New York hood called Al Capone. The young heavy has come to work for gang boss Johnny Torrio. Torrio is building a successful business, bootlegging booze and illegally supplying it to the people of Chicago. Torrio is one of many gangsters across the US turning a fortune by making sure the good times continue to roll. Torrio's illegal speakeasies serve his imported booze to thirsty Chicagoans across the south of the city.
Prohibition was a complete failure in big cities like New York and Chicago. And Chicago already had a reputation for having a corrupt government and a thriving underworld, even before Prohibition.
And Chicago finds itself well placed for this unintended criminal opportunity.
Chicago became the quintessential Prohibition city because of its location. It was close to Canada, just across Lake Michigan. That meant that booze could freely come into the city as an entry point.
Gangsters like Torrio quickly learn that there's big money in turning the smuggling and selling of booze into a slick business. Torrio's Chicago outfit becomes one of the biggest in the city, and the rapid growth means Torrio is always on the lookout for fresh talent. Enter Alphonse Capone, and the young man's ruthlessness and business sharps see him rapidly rise through the ranks.
He quickly identified Al Capone as a promising up-and-comer and a protege, and gradually let Al Capone have more and more responsibility.
But Torrio's success makes him a prime target for rival gangs. One night, Johnny Torrio is ambushed. He is shot repeatedly in the neck and groin. His attacker is one of his underworld business rivals, notorious gangster and bootlegger George Bugs Moran. Bugs aims the gun at Johnny's head, but as Torrio waits for the coup de grace, Bugs' gun misfires. He's out of bullets. Moran leaves Torrio to bleed out. Miraculously, Torrio survives, but the attack affects him deeply.
Johnny Torrio is almost murdered in front of his own apartment, and he decides enough is enough.
Torrio's sure Chicago is no longer safe, so he makes a life-changing decision for him and for Capone.
While Torrio is recovering from his gunshot wounds, he turns everything over to Al Capone, his former protege. And Capone, of course, is delighted by this.
Torrio leaves behind one of the biggest bootlegging syndicates in America and hands the whole Chicago outfit to Al Capone. At only 26 years old, Capone is now one of the youngest mob bosses in America, worth millions of dollars. And he moves quickly to put his own stamp on the Chicago underworld.
Capone is a very ruthless individual, a very violent individual. He came from a very poor background, realized very quickly that, the only way to get to the top was through, violence.
Capone clears the path to profit by bribing police, intimidating politicians, and threatening his rivals. Capone is soon outpacing his contemporaries in the other great Prohibition city, New York. Young gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. In fact, the only mobster who can keep pace with him is one savvy individual, a bright young man who will go on to become one of the most important names in U.S. gangster history, Lucky Luciano.
The two great contemporaries was Al Capone in Chicago and Charles Lucky Luciano in New York.
Lucky Luciano was a rising lieutenant in one of the big New York gangs, but he approaches business in a very different way to Capone.
There was an immense difference between them. Luciano did not look for the spotlight. He wasn't interested in attention. He knew secrecy was his best safeguard.
While Capone's success is built on fear and intimidation, Luciano believes violence inevitably leads to conflict.
His cardinal object was to be no wars between the families.
Attacking your rivals in the streets brought double trouble. Revenge attacks and unwanted police attention. If only the mobs could work together, they could make far more money without attracting the cops.
He wanted no hits and no headlines. If there was bloodshed, the body shouldn't be found. All he wanted was everyone should share the wealth.
But Luciano's way doesn't suit Capone. He doesn't want to work with the others. He just wants Chicago all to himself. And the man who stands between Capone and being king of the Chicago underworld is George Bugs Moran, the mobster who runs the north side of the city.
He thought he had to eliminate the Bugs Moran gang so he could be, if you want to call it, the boss of bosses. No competition in Chicago.
Capone and Moran are heading down the road to a brutal war.
The two of them became rivals for a criminal empire. Only one of them could possibly survive what was essentially a fight to the death.
Capone's gang launch a series of violent attacks on Moran's network.
Gentlemen.
And Moran hits back. Chicago has never seen violence like it. The press go into overdrive, calling the bloody conflict Chicago's beer war. Capone's on the way to becoming America's first ever celebrity gangster. Capone was never going to be an elusive mob boss working in the shadows. He makes the 5-star Metropole Hotel in the center of Chicago his new HQ. Capone takes over an entire floor, with hookers regularly visiting.
The Metropole became a kind of unofficial city hall in Chicago. Everybody knew where they could find him, or somebody who knew him. He was accessible. That was very unusual for a gangster. And he loved to see and be seen wherever he went. And he wore very conspicuous clothes. His suits were kind of an electric blue or electric purple. So he was a peacock, and he loved to show off.
Capone bribes local lawmakers, so he's free to flaunt his position in public without fear of arrest. He wants people to know the face of Al Capone.
Capone loves his notoriety, that he loves being seen as the bad guy. And he sort of plays this up, that, you know, the way he looks, the way he dresses, the way he acts, he's almost like a Hollywood imitation of a gangster in many ways.
He was a huge personality. He would go into a nightclub, he would go into a restaurant, and he would have to sit in the center of the room so that everybody would know that he was there.
But while Capone enjoys the limelight in Chicago, his headlines are causing serious alarm in New York.
Rivals like Lucky Luciano were appalled by this behavior because they felt Capone was just attracting attention to their illicit activities. They wish he would just stop and go away and let them continue without benefit of all this attention.
Luciano and other wannabe bosses aren't interested in showing off. They want to keep their mob business strictly out of sight of the public. Luciano's dislike of publicity comes from his years as a young mobster working for one of the greatest racketeers of his era, a man called Arnold Rothstein.
In New York, Arnold Rothstein was essentially the founder of Organized Crime, Inc. Numero uno, number one, the big man, the big bankroll, the guy who puts everything together.
Luciano had seen how Rothstein had run some of the biggest bootlegging operations in the early years of Prohibition. And he had done it by strictly staying in the shadows. Rothstein had even taught Luciano how to fit into mainstream society, how to present himself as a businessman and not appear to be a gangster showing off. Luciano had learned from Rothstein that for mob business to flourish, it must remain out of the public eye. And as he and other gangsters in New York make their plans in secret to expand the mob, they wish that Capone would just disappear from the headlines. But Chicago isn't going to go away. And Capone's war with Moran is about to spiral out of control. On September the 20th, 1926, Al Capone is eating at a favorite haunt at the Hawthorne Hotel on the outskirts of Chicago. As usual, Capone isn't hiding. He likes to be seen. And his arch-rival, Bugs Moran, has been watching him very closely indeed.
They sent carloads of gunmen out there to blast Capone.
The gunmen open fire indiscriminately. His bodyguard, Frank Rio, flings Capone to the floor to protect him. Thousands of bullets are unleashed in a matter of minutes.
Bullets and glass went flying, and Capone realized how vulnerable he was.
Remarkably, Capone survives. And now he has one thing on his mind: revenge. And the Chicago Beer War is about to make headlines across the U.S.
Capone's philosophy was kill and then worry about the consequences.
It was a war zone. They didn't use the word terrorism, but gangsters were certainly terrorizing the city, and it was seen as a national crisis.
The war rages on until 1929, when Capone decides to end it once and for all. When Bugs Moran gets an anonymous tip-off to buy a stolen load of Capone's bootlegged whiskey, he thinks it's the perfect opportunity to get the upper hand on his arch-rival. Moran tells his crew they'll do the deal at their secret garage on February the 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Moran's gang wait patiently for the load to arrive. But before the shipment comes in, Bug's crew get an unexpected visit from the cops. It looks like someone has ratted on the deal. Moran's gang aren't too worried. They can usually buy the cops' silence with a bribe or two. But not these cops. They aren't law enforcers. They're Capone's cold-blooded killers.
He had one of his chief assassins put together a plan to eliminate as many of the Bugs Moran gang members as possible. The assassins pretended to be policemen, had the gangsters line up against the wall, pretending to frisk them.
Moran's men realize too late this isn't a raid, it's a hit.
Capone decided to stage a massacre, but he didn't want to do it himself. He wasn't going to stand there with a machine gun and spatter people with bullets. He was much more likely to hire dangerous gunmen to assassinate somebody than to do it himself.
In a matter of seconds, Moran's squad lie dead on the floor. Photographs of the shocking scene spread across the nation. And the bloodbath is known forever as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. To make sure that no one can pin the killings on him, Capone sits a long way away in the company of an attorney. But he knows that he will be the beneficiary. With Moran out of the way, Chicago is his.
If Moran is dead, Capone realizes he's won, that he has sole control of the rackets in Chicago, and he's the top dog there, and it means that he's immensely wealthy. In today's dollars, he would be a billionaire.
But Moran wasn't among the 7 corpses lying on the garage floor. He never made it to the scene of the shooting. When he saw the cop car outside, he kept driving. Capone's arch-enemy is still alive, and Capone is about to discover that his botched Valentine's Day massacre will add powerful names to his list of enemies. While Capone is publicly battling with Moran for supremacy of Chicago, behind the scenes, up-and-coming mobster Lucky Luciano is plotting to make his own power play for New York. His vision is to end the violent infighting and ease the pressure from law enforcement. It's a revolution in the criminal underworld. With Capone's massacre still fresh in the headlines, Luciano and other New York mobsters plan a conference in Atlantic City.
A lot of what they wanted to talk about at the Atlantic City conference is how do we do this in a matter where not everybody ends up dead? How do we do this in a way that doesn't draw the attention from the authorities?
The obvious move is to get violence off the streets and to run the mob as a professional business. The approach couldn't suit Capone less. So Luciano and the others take the bull by the horns and invite the hot-headed Chicago killer to the Atlantic City conference to sit down and thrash it out.
Other gangsters, either in Chicago or in New York City, they were a little wary of him because they did regard him as a bit of a loose cannon, and they really didn't like his publicity-seeking personality.
Fresh in everyone's mind is the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Capone may love to seek out the limelight, but Luciano and the other mobsters predict severe consequences.
It was very rational for racketeers. As much as people think that they're these big tough guys who are afraid of nothing, they're very afraid of the government. And the last thing they want is to bring down the full force of the United States government on them.
Luciano, with the other gangsters, asks Capone to change his ways. But Capone takes issue with his competitors telling him how to run his business. And he storms out. It soon becomes clear that Capone should have listened to Luciano. Just as Luciano warned, Capone's wild killings soon come to the attention of the most important man in America.
There was a new president, Herbert Hoover, and his first thing was he was confronted by headlines from coast to coast about this massacre and about these outrageous activities in Chicago.
Hoover launches a special task force with one mission: get Capone.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point and the beginning of a concerted federal effort to get Capone, i.e. get him behind bars some way.
Luciano and other gangsters try to put out the public firestorm that Capone has started. They meet with journalists and tell them Capone's Chicago outfit will be disbanded. The story is just a ruse to diffuse the heat. But Capone knows the story is also a message. The other families are running out of patience. With both the US government and the mob on his case, it looks like it's time for Capone to lie low. Capone's next move takes everyone by surprise. He finds safety in the one place no one would expect him to go. He bribes police officers to get him sent to a corrupt jail in Philadelphia, where he finds conditions far from typical.
His stay in the Philadelphia penitentiary was more like a stay in a hotel or a rest cure. People waited on him hand and foot there. Everybody was corrupted, and he had a very easy time there. It was relaxing.
The prison term is in fact part of a deal brokered with Luciano and other mobsters. And Capone is living the high life at the expense of the US government. But back in Chicago, the feds have got different plans for Al Capone. Newsreel across the nation shows elite teams of Prohibition agents aggressively targeting Capone's empire of booze. The squad has been handpicked by the young and handsome Elliot Ness. Nicknamed the Untouchables, it's soon clear that Capone can't buy them off.
The agents who were sent to Chicago to get Capone weren't bribable. They were paid by the federal government, and they had a different allegiance, a different loyalty. They weren't locals, and this made a big difference.
Ness and his squad use wiretaps to find out where the illegal booze is kept, and then raid the warehouses. Ness turns Capone's love of publicity against him. He tips off newspaper reporters who show the world that even Al Capone isn't above the law. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department scrutinized Capone's financial affairs. Back in his Philadelphia cell, the man who craves publicity is getting plenty. But it isn't the kind he's used to. After 10 months behind bars, Big Al gets secretly let out of prison by officials and heads back to Chicago. When he returns, he finds the government have dragged his reputation through the mud. And Al Capone is no longer the king of Chicago. He's now public enemy number one. The obvious move for Capone would be to lie low, but he can't resist publicity. So Capone decides to organize a charm offensive.
He's a publicity hound. He loves, being in the spotlight. He loves seeing his picture in the newspaper. No publicity is bad publicity.
Capone counters the government's campaign and appeals directly to the people of Chicago.
Capone decided to improve his public image by opening a soup kitchen. Many of the working men who were his people were out of work, so he wanted to play the Robin Hood figure. But not only that, he wanted newsreel cameras to come and see him feeding the working people.
Capone says the real crooks weren't hustlers like him, but stock market speculators. But the story is always Al Capone.
Capone was a narcissist to the extent that he had a distorted impression of reality. So he saw himself as the center of almost anything that was going on, and he felt that he was a force for good in the world.
Capone may think he's a good guy, but the US government could hardly disagree more. Working diligently behind the scenes, federal agents have been building a strong case for tax evasion.
Capone was immensely rich. In today's money, he was worth billions, and he didn't pay his taxes.
The police smash open Capone's private safe.
He liked to keep records of what was coming to him to make sure he wasn't being cheated. So finally they had the goods on him.
Facing trial on income tax evasion, Al Capone finds an aroused government ready to put him behind bars.
Capone's indictment hits the headlines. But the charges don't bother Capone. His accountants can strike a deal.
When he found out he was under investigation, by federal auditors. He wanted to cop a plea, make a plea bargain, admit that he had not paid taxes for several years.
He offered the United States government $1 million to take care of his back taxes, but they wouldn't take that.
Even when he's brought to trial, Capone is confident that he can walk away. The King of Chicago has a surefire way to beat the rap.
It seemed like he was going to have another brush with the law. He didn't pay his taxes, haha, who would have expected that he would? And then he would eventually get off scot-free and bribe the jurors if necessary, which is what he did.
At the trial, Capone's men open the checkbooks. They pay off members of the jury. It's a classic mob tactic that has worked before, but not this time. At the last moment, the judge shows that the law is one step ahead.
The authorities realized that he probably would try to bribe the jurors or threaten them in some way so they wouldn't convict him. So they brought in, to everybody's surprise at the last minute, another jury who couldn't have been tampered with.
Capone couldn't be outfought, but he had been outthought. He gets an 11-year conviction for tax evasion.
Nobody got 11 years for income tax violation. That kind of case would have resulted in 18 months or something. But they gave him 11 years.
He was stunned. His lawyers were stunned. Everybody was stunned. It didn't seem possible that one could be jailed for such a, quote, minor offense. Of course, the government wanted to make an example of Capone.
Al Capone, the man who once publicly beat a mayor, now finds himself publicly humiliated by the law. And things will go from bad to worse for Capone, as he discovers that prison life isn't so easy when everyone knows your face. On October 24th, 1931, Al Capone, one of the best-known mobsters in the world, goes to jail for tax evasion.
They didn't get him for any of his gunplay, for any of his murders, for any of his racketeering. They got him on income tax evasion, something he had never anticipated.
Capone's downfall makes the news across the world. It looks like the US government has dealt a mortal blow to organized crime. But in fact, Capone has provided gangsters like Lucky Luciano with a smokescreen. Beyond the glare of publicity, a new, secretive, and highly effective organization of mobsters is taking shape. And they're happy that Capone is locked away.
Other gangsters rejoiced that Capone was now no longer at large. On the other hand, they were afraid that the same thing could happen to them. Gangsters learned to avoid publicity from Capone because they saw where it got him. They realized it made him a target for federal investigations that eventually put him in jail.
Outside, Lucky Luciano will make sure that the negative publicity of gangland violence will never again damage their business. When Luciano makes his play for control of the New York mob, he does it not by ordering a public massacre, but with just 2 strategic hits. First, he sacrifices his own godfather, Joe Masseria. And next, Masseria's arch-rival, Salvatore Barazzano. Luciano is now the most powerful mobster in New York. Soon he will lead the Commission, the mob's board of directors, and usher in a new era of cooperation and wealth for what will become the American Mafia. Where Capone failed in his Valentine's Day massacre, Lucky Luciano takes everything with just 2 deaths. Behind bars, his empire gone, Capone's reputation is in tatters. Now the government decide to use Capone for some publicity of their own. They move America's most high-profile gangster to the New Island fortress of Alcatraz.
President Hoover said to the warden, "If you want the world to know what a horrible place Alcatraz is, transfer Al Capone out there." And that is exactly what they did. He was in a 6-foot by 10-foot cell. And they put him on the outside where he could look across the bay at San Francisco. For people to come to visit him, they had to get on a ferry boat and go across the water.
No longer the feared man he once was. For the first time in his life, Capone tries to keep a low profile.
When Al Capone was in Alcatraz, it was humiliating in part because other prisoners were not afraid of him. He was given a very derogatory term, the wop with the mop, because he was often seen mopping.
Capone learns that his reputation is now a magnet for criminals wanting to make a name. One is Jimmy Lucas, a member of a gang called the Texas Cowboys. Capone's fall from grace is complete. His life in the spotlight is bearing bitter harvest. In time, prison doctors discover that perhaps Capone wasn't entirely to blame for his reckless behavior.
Al Capone suffered from syphilis. He acquired it from prostitutes as a young man in Brooklyn, didn't realize that he had it, and it explains a lot about his behavior and his temperamental outbursts throughout his life. As he got older, it also shattered his health because there was no cure for it at the time.
In 1939, Capone is released from prison on medical advice. By now, the syphilis had spread to his brain, and Al Capone has the mental age of a 12-year-old.
The family had a big party for him in Chicago when he got released. And my mother said that Al was there, but he would come up to her and say, "Who are you?" And then he would go over to his own sister and say, "Who are you?"
Al Capone will live out the rest of his life in seclusion in his mansion in Florida. A gangster without a gang. On January the 18th, 1947, shortly after celebrating his 48th birthday, Al Capone suffers a massive stroke and slips into a coma. At almost the exact same time, some of the biggest mob bosses in the US meet in Havana, Cuba. They plan the future of the mob. A future without Al Capone. Instead, it will be led by Lucky Luciano.
He wanted the American Mafia to be a mirror of American capitalism, to cash in on anything that worked with capitalism. And he wasn't going to be restricted. This was a new era, and he was going to modernize the mob. And that is exactly what he did.
A few days after his stroke, Capone dies. The era of celebrity mobster is over, and a new generation of gangsters is born. Now mobsters will work together to create a secret society that dominate crime for generations. They call it our thing, La Cosa Nostra. The world will know it by another name, the American Mafia. The foundations for this organization were laid by Al Capone. But his contribution wasn't through inspiration. It was his brutal and public mistakes that had taught the mob how not to behave. His career may have ended in disaster, but to this day, Al Capone defiantly remains the most famous name in mob history. Public enemy number one.
Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and join me on a trip to the Windy City, the birthplace of the Untouchables. It is 1930 in Prohibition Chicago, and its once peaceful streets have turned into an active war zone that is fought over by brutal gangs, each vying for power in the illegal bootlegging trade. The most dominant is the South Side Gang, led by the infamous mobster Al Capone. His violent rise to power has made him think he's above the law, and for good reason. With all the cops, judges, and politicians in his pocket, no one has dared cross him yet. That was until a Prohibition agent called Elliot Ness and his elite team single-handedly took him down. At least that's what happens in the movie. History, on the other hand, paints a completely different picture, one that I will share over the course of this review, and piece by piece we will uncover the true story behind the Untouchables. Now, before I get into the Untouchables, I thought it'd be a good idea to tell a bit of the history behind Prohibition and how it was able to lead to the rise of organized crime in Chicago. Between 1920 and 1933, a constitutional ban was set in place to abolish the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol within the United States. A president during this time called Herbert Hoover once described Prohibition as the great social and economic experiment, but unbeknownst to him, it was one that America was destined to fail. By the dawn of the 20th century, a grassroots social movement was making waves in the political landscape. Its deeply tied religious beliefs viewed alcohol as a blight on America's morality and condemned its consumption as the sole reason behind all its woes. It was known as the temperance movement, and from the very beginning, it was women who had helped champion the cause. Many of them had seen firsthand the destructive role alcohol had played within their families and marriages, whether it had been as victims of domestic abuse or to witness their alcoholic fathers and husbands spend away their life savings. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was amongst the first to successfully push through the idea of temperance into the public eye, that began dividing Americans with its politics into two camps: the wets and the dries, with the wets supporting the consumption and sale of alcohol, whilst the dries didn't. A prominent figurehead of the dries was a man named Wayne Wheeler, who was the leader of a temperance society called the Anti-Saloon League, which was by far the most effective. Unlike the WCTU, it was an organization made up of both men and women, and as far as its policies were concerned, the total ban of alcohol was the only thing they cared about. The Anti-Saloon League was able to rise to power by directing its devout followers to vote for politicians who supported them, and vote against the ones who didn't. The League wasn't interested whether they were Democrats or Republicans. As long as they played to their fiddle, they were guaranteed votes, even if that meant those politicians were privately drinkers themselves. A huge turning point for the dries came in April 1917, when America entered the First World War. The Anti-Saloon League, the WCTU, and other temperance societies banded together to exploit an anti-German hysteria that was gripping the nation. They did this by pumping out propaganda specifically targeting German-American beer makers. Suddenly, drinking beer brands like Schlitz, Miller, Blatz, or Busch was made to seem like an act of treason. With public opinion on their side, the Anti-Saloon League pushed Washington to institute a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for the war effort. This was a huge win for the dry activists, but they went even further by proposing a prohibition amendment to Congress. They didn't just want a law passed to ban alcohol, as laws could be repealed or changed. The Dries wanted it to be immortalized into the American Constitution, as no amendment had ever been repealed before then. And so on August 1st, 1917, the United States Senate voted 65-20 in favor of the 18th Amendment. The House of Representatives followed shortly afterwards, and largely voted in favor on December 18th, 1917. In an effort to stave off prohibition, the Wet supporters in Congress had previously made a deal with the Dries, granting them only 6 years to receive the support for 3/4 of the United States for final approval. They had no idea it would only take 11 months. It was ratified into law on January 16th, 1919, and went into effect just a year later. And so, when the stroke of midnight began to approach on January 16th, 1920, people began to wonder, would Prohibition finally put an end to the nation's thirst for alcohol?
3, 2, 1! Prohibition!
As the temperance movement patted itself on the back for a job well done, its hopes for a dry America was naively mistaken. Enforcement of the law in the rural areas and small towns from which they sprang was easy, since many in those communities had long since been sympathetic to the idea of temperance. But to enforce that same law in the big cities was another thing entirely. Now, before I get into that, I would like to briefly talk about the law that enforced Prohibition itself. Known as the Volstead Act, it forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages. This included everything from beer, wine, to hard spirits. But the consumption of these beverages wasn't illegal in itself, and any alcohol that's purchased before Prohibition was also legal to own. This gave private clubs and the super rich an entire year to buy as much booze as they could cram into their cellars, and anyone who couldn't afford to do so could still enjoy a drink from their local bootlegger, as long as they didn't get caught buying it. But even the criminals stood a good chance of never doing hard time. Ironically, the same people who supported Prohibition were also the types who didn't believe in big government spending. 3 of America's presidents during the 1920s were Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All 3 were Republican, and their parties dominated Congress. They had all the power they could possibly want, and yet they spent as little money as they could on enforcing Prohibition. Here's an example for you. The federal law enforcement agency that was formed to enforce the Volstead Act was called the Bureau of Prohibition. However, it only had 1,500 agents assigned to cover the entire country. That's 1 agent for every 70,000 Americans.
1, 2, 3. Bear, 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 gently bear, bear, bear.
I guess they just hoped everyone would follow the honor system. Or more accurately, the states and small local governments would be kind enough to pick up the bill themselves. But they, of course, argued, why should they? This is a federal law after all, and if the federal government was so eager to pass it in the first place, then they should be the ones to pay for it. So you get the situation where everyone is just buck passing their responsibilities and little gets resolved. But whilst all this was going on, the criminal underworld was making a mockery of the Volstead Act. Despite early signs of success at the start of Prohibition, with a decline in public drunkenness and a 30% drop in alcohol consumption, the decade that followed saw a new generation rise up and brazenly break this new law the conservative parents had thrust upon them. And these scofflaws, as they were called, did so not by visiting the saloons of the past, but at the speakeasy, underground bars and clubs that were hidden by a secret door. If you had the right password, you were let in by a doorman, and if you visited the largest of these venues, then you were treated to a glorious night of entertainment, with jazz bands playing out the greatest hits of the 20s, to flappers dancing away on the ballroom floor, and the finest alcohol you could possibly afford. Nothing within these walls indicated that Prohibition was working at all. In fact, it was the era's worst kept secret. Local law enforcement often tolerated these establishments, seeing alcohol as a harmless vice, with some being customers themselves. But mainly the reason why was because they were bribed to look the other way. Corruption was a huge problem within many police departments, and none were more so than in Chicago. Throughout Prohibition, no city was as notorious with bootlegging as Chicago, and no man more infamous in its trade than Alphonse Scarface Capone. This Brooklyn-born mobster would dominate the headlines for years to come. When the 18th Amendment first came into effect, thousands of breweries and distilleries across America were forced to close. Seizing the opportunity, Capone and his old mentor, Johnny Torrio, started buying the ones in and around Chicago. By controlling production and supplying the thousands of speakeasies across the city with their manufactured beer, their profits skyrocketed into a multi-million-dollar business. At its very height, Capone would make over $60 million a year, and he spared no expense in buying protection from the law. These ranged from bribing cops on the beat to prohibition agents, judges, even the Republican mayor, William Hale Thompson. The scale of public officials that he was able to line in his pockets arguably made Chicago one of the most corrupt cities in America. Each of them turned a blind eye to his bootlegging racket, even at the risk of public safety. Capone's rise to power was not unchallenged. Although the Italian mafia controlled much of the south side of Chicago, the north side was mostly ruled by the Irish. At first they came to an agreement to sell their booze in each other's territory and share the profits, but eventually the treaty was broken and a 5-year war ensued. Labeled by the press as the Beer Wars, rival gangsters battled each other for ultimate power, with drive-bys and shootouts become a regular occurrence on public streets. As the body cam made national headlines, the police did little to contain the violence. Judges and juries were bought off as usual, even as things escalated. The Beer Wars reached its bloody conclusion on a day that would shock and appall the American people. On February 14, 1929, Italian gangsters disguised as policemen rounded up 7 leaders of the Northside Gang's hierarchy and mowed them down with machine gun fire. At the time it happened, Al Capone was on holiday in Florida, but everyone knew that he was behind it. It would come to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In the short term, no one was arrested, and the Northside Gang crumbled into the dust, leaving the entire city of Chicago in Capone's hands. But in the long term, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre would prove to be the turning point in Capone's career, with President Hoover and the federal government deciding that they had enough of the defiant mobster and his obvious flaunting of the law. Declaring him public enemy number 1, they worked on a plan that would finally bring him down for good. Whenever I decide to review a historical movie, I always have to ask myself, how much should its accuracy affect my viewing experience? What do I do if I enjoyed the movie when I first watched it, but then found out later that most of it wasn't true, or indeed vice versa? What if I hated the movie, and then found out that for the most part it was accurate? It's already happened to me a couple of times in this channel's history. For example, I love the movie Gladiator, but even I have to admit that from a historical angle, the movie's full of shit. And then there was Oliver Stone's Alexander, an awful movie that bored me to tears, but it was for the most part historically accurate. Now I have to admit that when I first watched The Untouchables, I enjoyed it. It's a well-written movie with a great cast and is set in a fascinating time period, and I'm sure that many of you feel the same way as well. But unfortunately, as a historical movie, it's mostly inaccurate and bears little resemblance to what actually happened. The basic premise of The Untouchables is that a Prohibition agent called Elliot Ness created an elite team of honest cops, and together they single-handedly brought down Al Capone and put him away behind bars. Just that alone, the main plot of the movie, is not the way how it went down. So over the course of this chapter, I'm going to go step by step and point out its biggest inaccuracies, so you can get a clearer picture of what actually happened. And from time to time, I'll also point out what the movie gets right. I guess the best place we should start would be with the Untouchables themselves. Let's begin with Elliot Ness. When we're first introduced to Ness, we see that he is a family man with a loving wife and a young daughter. But by 1930, the real Ness had only been married for a year, and he didn't have children. This may seem trivial, but the reason why the filmmakers made this change is so Ness has an emotional attachment to the case. If you can remember at the beginning of the movie, we see another little girl the same age as his daughter die in an explosion at a speakeasy on Capone's orders. Which, by the way, I'm not 100% sure happened either, because by 1930, the beer wars were already finished, and had resulted in Al Capone's victory. It wasn't the death of a little girl that convinced the federal government to come after Capone, but the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. But I guess that the main reason they gave Ness a daughter is so that his situation can be even more dire when the gangsters come and threaten his family.
Nice to have a family.
Yes, it is.
Man should take care. See that nothing happens to him.
Even though Ness didn't have a daughter, the threats made against him and his wife were very real indeed. They were the last-ditch efforts made by Capone to intimidate Ness into giving up his investigation. But before he did that, Capone tried the usual tactic of bribery, which we do see in the movie when Arthur Slugworth hands Ness a manila envelope. Now, an interesting thing to know is that the envelope contained $2,000 in cash, which was the annual wage of a prohibition officer back then, and Capone was willing to pay that amount every week. And since almost everyone in Chicago took bribes back then, the fact that Elliot Ness and his men didn't is what made them stand out.
You fellas are untouchable, is that the thing? No one can get to you?
You took Capone.
Hey, everyone can be gotten to.
Then I'll see him in hell.
But just because Ness refused to take bribes didn't make him squeaky clean. The scene where he tells the Chicago police to stop drinking because it's against the law is a little hypocritical, considering that the real man was a heavy drinker himself. Next up, we have the Italian cop George Stone, who is also called Giuseppe Petri. Stone is a completely fictional character, and I've been unable to find evidence of the Untouchables ever having any Italians on the team. My guess is that the filmmakers needed at least one Italian good guy, so they wouldn't feel too one-sided with the villains. Then we have Jimmy Malone, who is performed superbly by Sean Connery. He is undoubtedly my favourite character in the movie, even though Sean Connery has the worst Irish accent I've ever heard, albeit slightly more convincing than his Spanish one in Highlander.
I'm not Spanish, I'm Egyptian.
Anyway, the character of Jimmy Malone is the most interesting to me because he's an old beat cop who knows the streets of Chicago, and he takes Elliot Ness under his wing. So you have a mentor-student relationship going on between them. Sadly, Jimmy Malone is also a fictional character, but he does seem to be loosely based on a real guy called Michael Malone, who works as an undercover agent for the IRS. But what Malone was working on had nothing to do with what the Untouchables were doing, so Elliot Ness and Michael Malone never met. What Michael Malone had done was successfully infiltrate Capone's inner circle and kept tabs on all his illegal money-making schemes, and it was his investigation that was crucial in Capone's downfall and had nothing to do with the Prohibition case the Untouchables were working on. Which brings me to the final guy on Ness's team, Oscar Wallace. Right from his introduction, Wallace pitches his idea to Elliot Ness of what he thinks will be the key to putting away Al Capone.
He has not filed a return since 1926.
A return?
An income tax return.
At first, Ness dismisses the idea and focuses his investigation on Capone's bootlegging operation, but eventually he comes around and sees that arresting the mobster for income tax evasion really is the most effective way. However, the character Oscar Wallace didn't exist, but he does seem to be heavily inspired by the real historical figure Frank J. Wilson, and Wallace does resemble him a little bit. Frank Wilson was the real hero who brought down Capone, not Elliot Ness. He was an IRS agent who was tasked to dig up all the files he could possibly find and link the undeclared millions between Capone and his gang. Throughout his investigation, he stayed in his stuffy office and read countless documents before finding ledgers that incriminated Capone himself. It was his investigation, and that of Michael Malone's, that contributed the most in Capone's prosecution. But the reason why their efforts are credited by Eliot Ness in the movie is because bookkeeping and tedious paperwork is nowhere near as exciting as a Prohibition team getting into gunfights and taking on the Chicago Mafia. But even that never happened. Not a single member of the Untouchables was killed during their investigation, nor did they ever travel to the US-Canadian border and get into a Wild West shootout with a bunch of mobsters smuggling in Canadian whiskey, which, by the way, never made sense to me. I'm not entirely convinced whether the Canadian Mounties would risk their lives confiscating smuggled whiskey, since alcohol was completely legal in Canada. I mean, I can't say for certain though, but I would love to read your comments about this. There's also the scene where Eliot Ness takes on the real-life gangster Frank Nitti. It starts off when Ness spots Nitti carrying a pistol in court, and he summons a police officer to escort him out to be disarmed. Now, a cool thing to know is that one of Capone's henchmen was removed from court for carrying a gun, but it wasn't Frank Nitti. So out in the hall, Nitti shows the two that he has a permit for his pistol, and what I thought was a really nice touch is that the permit was signed by William Hale Thompson, the mayor of Chicago. This didn't happen, of course, but it still feels authentic since the real William Thompson was deep in Capone's pocket and is remembered as one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. So anyway, when Frank Nitti gets his gun back, an altercation between him and Ness erupts into a rooftop chase scene that ultimately concludes with Ness straight up murdering the man by chucking him off a building into a parked car. And then Ness says my favorite line in the entire movie.
Where is Nitti? He's in the car.
As much as I would love that scene to be true, it sadly isn't. Eliot Ness never killed Frank Nitti. Nitti didn't die until 1943 when he committed suicide, so that's another exciting bit in the movie that was made up for dramatic effect. The same goes for the final big shootout. I'm talking about the scene where the Untouchables and some mobsters get into a gunfight at Union Station, whilst a baby in a pram starts tumbling down the stairs. This scene is actually inspired by the Odessa step sequence from the 1925 Soviet silent film Battleship Potemkin. If you put both scenes side by side, you could see it's a great homage to one of the most important films ever made. So if all the best bits in the film didn't happen, what did the real Untouchables do exactly? And why weren't they the ones to bring down Al Capone? Well, when the federal government decided to originally go on the offensive, they did so by planning a two-pronged attack. One was by investigating Capone's tax evasion through the IRS, and the other would be by targeting his bootlegging operations with the Bureau of Prohibition. What the Untouchables mainly did was raid suspected breweries and destroy any illegal liquor they found. At first, these raids were successful and provoked Capone into ordering a kill order on them.
I want you to get this fuck where he breathes. I want you to find this Nancy boy Eliot Ness. I want him dead. I want his family dead. I want his house burnt to the ground. I want to go to the middle of the night. I want to piss on his ashes.
It wasn't long before the success of the raids and their recognition by the press began to get into Eliot Ness's head. And in a ludicrous fashion, he would call journalists beforehand to let them know which brewery they were going to hit, so he could have his picture taken right before they burst in through the door. As expected, some of these journalists were corrupt as well, and they would give the mob a heads up when to clear the place. And yet, despite the hostility between the two, it is widely believed that neither Ness nor Capone ever met in person. There was never a confrontation at the Lexington Hotel or in the courtroom. Moving away from the Untouchables for a bit, I'd like to briefly cover the film's portrayal of Al Capone, and I'm glad to say that they did a pretty good job. Capone really did reside at the luxury Lexington Hotel, and he did flaunt his power by speaking to the press about his bootlegging rackets. He not only bragged about it, but he also played the victim, which is what essentially made him into such a public figure. And then there's the famous banquet scene where Capone beats one of his henchmen to death with a baseball bat. Now I have to admit it that when I first watched it, I thought it was made up just to show how evil he was. But surprisingly, this scene is based on a real event. Except it wasn't one guy Capone killed with a bat, but two. What allegedly happened was that two of Capone's hitmen, one being Albert Anselmi and the other John Scalise, were hatching a plot to murder their boss and take over his empire. Learning about this, Capone invited the conspirators to a feast in their honor, with all the other capos. Then halfway through the meal, he had his men hold down the traitors as he beat them half to death with a baseball bat. Then they were finished off later with a few gunshots to the head. And the final inaccuracy I think deserves a mention is the scene where the judge switches the jury halfway through the trial. In the movie, Ness discovers a list showing that all the jurors have been bribed by Capone, and he tells the judge, but the judge refuses to accept it as evidence until Ness lies about it and says that his name was on the list too. Now, whilst it's true that the entire jury was bribed for the Capone case, Judge Wilkinson certainly wasn't. He had correctly anticipated that the jury would be bribed, and right before the trial began, he switched the juries. So as you can see, there are more things that the Untouchables got wrong than it did get right. The film was more interested in glamorizing the legend of Eliot Ness than revealing the true story. Normally that would frustrate me as a history buff, but in the end, I genuinely believe that these creative liberties still felt within the spirit of the period. They didn't stretch things so far as to betray the source material. Of course, I would prefer if they tried sticking closer to the truth, but the inaccuracies weren't enough to infuriate me in the end. Overall, I'm willing to admit that it is a fun movie, but it's clearly meant for a casual audience. If that isn't a problem for you, then I highly recommend you check it out. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about The Untouchables. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.